Okay, it's 3:32, so let's get started. I want to welcome you to today's session on how to create a high-quality engagement plan to disseminate STEM research and innovations with the Evidence Quality and Reach Hub. So my name is Jen Chingwei. I'm with the American Institutes for Research, and I will facilitate today's session. So we're going to get started with a little housekeeping, and the first part of the housekeeping is that we are recording this session. So AIR allows for the recording of audio, visuals, participants, and other information sent, verbalized, or utilized during business-related meetings. And so by joining this meeting, you automatically consent to such recordings. Any participant who prefers not to participate could be via audio only, should disable their video camera so that only their audio is captured. Video and/or audio recordings of any AIR session shall not be transmitted to an extended third party without the permission of AIR. So I do want to let you know that this recording will be available to you after the session, and it will be posted on the Cadre website. So you will have an opportunity to refer back to it, and we're also going to use this for some of our future offerings. So we will explain a little bit more about those later. Next slide, please. We also would like to make this session as inclusive as possible. So you have some examples of how we're going to have an inclusive session. Our intention is to engage everyone. We're going to be using Zoom. We're going to be using some of the features of Zoom, and we're going to explain a little bit more about that. If you have any problems during the session that are technical in nature, please reach out to Carol in the chat, and she will try to help you with that. So if you have any problems with your audio or anything else, please reach out to Carol. So next slide, thank you. We're going to be using Q&A and also chat, and at some point, we're going to also, if there's time, offer verbal questions. Next slide. And we're also going to be doing some polls and sharing the results and some interesting questions that we have for you. So what's going to happen is just going to pop up on your screen. You're probably pretty familiar with it, and you just answer and submit, and then we'll share the results so everybody can see them. And now let's take a look at our agenda. So first, we're going to give you a little introduction to the Evidence Quality and Reach Hub. This may be something that's new to you. And then we're going to move into the topical content. You can see the different sections that our speaker, Emily Loney, is going to cover today. And then we're going to talk about next steps and some future offerings that we have. So with that, let's get started with just a brief introduction to the EQR Hub, which is the Evidence Quality and Reach Hub. That's what EQR stands for. And this work is made possible by the National Science Foundation under the grant shown on your screen. Next slide, please. Our charge is to provide current and aspiring STEM education researchers with really targeted learning opportunities on research methods, knowledge translation, and diversity, equity, and inclusion approaches between now and 2024. So we're going to be creating webinars, workshops, communities of practice, and we have one coming up that we're going to tell you about at the end. And also to engage in individualized consultations to help you create help with the robustness of your grant applications for National Science Foundation funding. Next slide, please. We have a page on the Cadre website, and Carol's going to pop it in the chat. And we also have a link to some research methods webinars that we previously provided under a National Science Foundation grant that you can have access to. That's in the blue box. So both of those links are going to be dropped into the chat so that you could take advantage of that. And the recording for today will actually be on the Cadre page for the EQR Hub. So with that in mind, let's move on to our core topic. And you can see the subtopics we're going to cover today. I won't read them. But before we get started, we thought we'd just launch a quick poll just to get a sense of the experience level in creating a dissemination plan. So if you don't mind, just take a moment, answer this question real quick, and then we're going to look at the results. So do you have a lot of experience, some experience, a little experience, or no experience? So of course, all are welcome, and the topic addresses all the audiences, but we'd just like to get a sense of where you're at. So we'll give everybody another 10, 15 seconds. Still have a couple people that didn't participate yet, but we have pretty good response so far. There's one person left who didn't participate yet. Well, we'll let that go. Okay, so let's share the results. And you could see that we actually have a tie between a little and no experience, and a little bit fewer of some experience, and one person with a lot of experience. So I'm sure that you will all have your needs met today with our speaker. So thank you for participating. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Emily Loney. She's an American Institutes for Research, senior researcher. And she currently serves as the dissemination lead for the Regional Educational Laboratory Midwest, leading a team in the development of website content, social media events, and resources like infographics and videos that connect research to practice. In overseeing this work, she ensures that research and practice partners are engaged in the development and the implementation of communication strategies to guarantee that products are accessible and relevant. She also serves as project director of the College Completion Network, and in this role, Emily supervises a core staff of 8, provides a conceptual framework for developing a final synthesis of research team findings, develops and implements a multifaceted communication strategy for the network, and supervises research team leads in their work on a research and practice policy scan. So Emily is experienced in working with state leaders and has been involved in technical assistance projects related to the Every Student Succeeds Act, deeper learning, and educator evaluation standards. She earned a Master's of Public Policy from Duke University and is a certified project management professional. So now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily. Thank you, Emily.
Oh, thank you, Jen. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's discussion. It was helpful to see that poll to get a sense of your experience and familiarity with engagement planning. And like Jen said, we welcome you to this conversation, whether you're new to developing engagement planning or might be have some experience with this and are hoping to get some tips and strategies. We will have some pauses for questions along the way, but certainly throughout this presentation, feel free to add your questions to the chat box, and then we can get to them during the facilitated Q&A time. So I wanted to begin our call today to talk about why is dissemination important. You're here maybe because you already see that importance, but really some things that came to mind for me first is to amplify research findings and project activities. We know that when research teams have invested a lot of energy and time into projects, it's really important to get the final products and reports completed and out to a wide audience. I also know that there are benefits to sharing what's being learned even at interim stages of a process. And so teams may value being able to share learnings from early phases of the R&D process to inform other people's efforts and spur innovation. So again, we're talking both about projects where you might be sharing findings at the very end, but maybe even projects where you're hoping to share out some results at interim points in a project. Secondly, dissemination is really valuable in connecting with collaborators, community members, partners. Being thoughtful about dissemination planning allows you to consider how to connect with those who were involved in the research and development process, but also the wider community who might have a stake in the project. And certainly it can allow you to connect with current and future partners and future funders. Dissemination can help you build the use of new resources and information. Uh, Dissemination planning can help you to get resources in the hands of practitioners and others who can actually put this research into practice. And finally, affect change. This is a broad goal, but ultimately we know that the goals of research are not solely to learn and to understand, but also to inform and change practice. And so dissemination can really help translate results, help make them usable by your different audiences and people who will really be able to put that information into practice. Next slide, please. So wanted to just we've used the words dissemination and engagement already, and wanted to get your thoughts on what is the difference between dissemination and engagement. Do you see a difference in those terms? And I think we're going to encourage you just to enter them in the chat box. Is that right, Jen?
Yes.
So why don't you just in the chat box, do you see a difference between these two terms? And if so, how might you define those two?
And actually, we do have a poll question. So why don't people put their thoughts in the chat and we can also launch the poll. Sorry, Emily, I missed that. So we're going to get open-ended responses in the chat, and here you can choose from 4 options in the poll. And if you need to make the poll wider so you could read the whole thing, just move to the edge. It becomes a little arrow and you can drag it out. So people are still participating in the poll. We're about 50%, so please take a moment to respond. Give everybody 5 more seconds. Well, wonderful. We had a 92% response rate. So let's take a look at what that looks like. And again, if you can't see the whole sentence, just enlarge the window.
Great, thanks, Jen. And I've been nodding my head, seeing everybody's comments come in. I think how you're thinking about this is reflective of how my team and I often think about dissemination and engagement. Sometimes dissemination can be very much that one-way street. So a team thinking about how do we want to get the word out. But I do think about engagement as a more iterative process that we'll get to, but also one that can involve partners throughout the design process and also leverages their networks in getting the word out. So a bit more of a collaborative process. Next slide, please. So here, just a little bit of unpacking these terms a little bit more. The way that I conceive of the value of engagement planning is that it's meant to be collaborative, interactive, and engaging. Ideally, engagement is a two-way iterative process of researcher and practitioner exchanges that support the development of relevant research, as well as the use of that research in practice. There really isn't necessarily a right or wrong term. You'll definitely see both in different settings, but in this presentation, I'll be focused on the framing of engagement, in part to frame this iterative process. I also want to just say that the focus of today's webinar will be largely on reaching external audiences and getting research into practice. We will briefly touch on approaches to connect with other researchers, but I imagine many of you already have journals and have identified places where you might want to share your research. And what we're focusing a little bit more on today is getting your information out to wider groups of audiences. So what is an engagement plan? You can conceive of an engagement plan as a living document that maps out plans for disseminating research findings or products to those who will use the information. Developing an engagement plan as part of a research activity allows a team to promote knowledge utilization and support stronger understanding and use of research. And again, the goal of developing this plan as part of the overall research activity is to make the findings, products, and resources accessible and actionable. Sometimes teams may traditionally do more of the communication planning towards the end of a research project's timeline. But again, throughout this presentation, we're going to suggest that communication planning shouldn't be an afterthought at the end, but really an iterative activity that is planned out and implemented through the lifespan of a project. And I'll walk through what that looks like on the next slides. So when does engagement planning occur? So here in green, you'll see boxes that map out the general steps of a research activity, and in blue, some of the parallel stages that you would go through to plan out an engagement plan. Again, engagement planning, you'll see that there's multiple places to touch base with your engagement planning throughout the lifespan of a project. And beginning early in the process really allows you to be proactive in identifying audiences, goals, and proactively planning out the work. So thank you. So in the first stage, as a project launches, a project is likely mapping out timelines for research activities, identifying collaborators who will be involved in the work, planning deliverables, budgets. And this is an ideal time to begin dissemination planning, even at the beginning, parallel with the broad project plans. Again, this is an iterative process. So this is the point where you're going to be identifying initial goals, audiences, plans for what you might like to do at the end of the process. Next slide. Then as a project moves into implementation, again, the team can revisit the engagement plan as well as the assumptions included in the document. You might want to see if you need to make any adjustments given shifts in the project. For example, a project might identify additional or different audiences for the work. And then broadly, I've called this analysis, but typically this is the phase of the research activities where you're getting into the data, looking at how everything is coming together. And this is typically the point where a team will want to review its intended goals and audiences for engagement planning, just to make any adjustments based off of your initial analyses and results. Again, given the scale of the results, where the project seems to be headed, that might inform the scale of what you want to plan in terms of communication activities. You might also want to think about the scale of resources that you want to make at the end of a project and the type of time and resources that will be required for them. Certainly some activities will require more lead-in time, depending on whether you're working with graphic designers, videographers, writing new briefs, but it's helpful to start to plan out at least the initial length of those products so that you can think ahead towards the release. So again, just one back to analysis, thanks. Just again, you want to begin to formalize timelines and a work plan for any products when you're in the analysis phase. And then just bear in mind the timeline that might be required for those resources. Great, now we can move over to the release of products, which is often, as you're hitting the point where project results are released, it's always nice to be able to release any dissemination resources that you might have as companion to the final results. That really helps to amplify and really publicize the results. Also helps to have your findings and results reach different audiences, maybe in plain language form, in new accessible formats. But again, you can get a strong presence by kind of layering different strategies on top of one another. I would suggest that a component of a strong engagement plan will also include an outreach strategy. typically at least including some sample social media language, maybe brief summaries of the products that you can share either internally with your organization's communication office or with other identified partners who might help to elevate those resources. And then typically we suggest that you outline kind of intended audiences, people who can elevate the outreach so that as part of your outreach strategy, you're sharing these materials with them to further amplify them. Great. And then finally, as the project wraps up, it's helpful to measure outcomes related to the dissemination. And again, early on in the process is when you likely are going to be identifying the metrics. So early on, maybe even in the first or second phases, is when a team might identify the strategy in terms of what metrics will make most sense for the intended products, for the focus of this. But then as a project wraps up, it's a chance to reflect on how did the engagement activities go and capture the success in terms of reaching different audiences. We'll get into some metrics to consider. It really varies on what kinds of platforms and your overall goals. Certainly, if you're sharing information on an online platform, you could look at metrics related to video views, analytics related to clicks or engagement on websites, if that's something you might have access to. You can also measure outcomes in terms of use of products. How have partners used these resources? How many times have they been shared? And you can also reflect on what kinds of impact stories could you tell about how the project's results were used. So just it's helpful to be thoughtful about not just the planning of releasing things, but also to kind of capture the effectiveness of how things went. And I think now we're going to take a brief pause just to reflect and think about what questions you might have. So I'm going to pause here and just welcome you to enter any questions that you might have thus far in the chat.
No questions so far, Emily.
Okay. Well, no problem. Dean has a question. Do you recommend producing a written plan, and who should contribute to this? We typically have a formal template that we use with our projects, which is a written document. Typically, it's used as an internal team to organize the components that we talked about. We don't typically share it with like an external funder, although we might share some sample language or reflect on that, but it really is to organize the team. And so staff can collaborate on it and kind of use it as a guiding document. So again, when you're revisiting at different stages, you have a chance to kind of look together to say, this was our assumption 2 months ago. Does that still square with where this project is headed?
We have another question from Patty. Can you offer some possible partners, i.e. science museums?
Great question. We're going to talk a little bit more about audiences in the next slide. I think I can reflect, I am not as much of an expert in the STEM space, but I would say one activity that we do is to identify who might be either partners who could amplify the message of this given activity. I think museums could be one. It could be other types of associations. So sometimes, science teacher membership associations, math teacher, really depends on your audience. But I think with a research team, it's helpful early on to think about who is in the broad landscape of users who would use these findings or benefit from knowing them. And even maybe building out a table to kind of think about who's going to be potential users of this and who do we want to reach. And it might be individual organizations or even sometimes intermediary organizations or membership associations.
Emily, we have a great question from Lara, and she writes, the planning occurs for most of the phases of the project, but should the plan involve engaging the audience in the early phase of research data collecting?
Laura, are you thinking about actual research activities or something specific to how you might engage the audience in the kind of parallel strategy of dissemination planning? I don't know if you want to add in. Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, certainly some research projects are designed in a very collaborative nature. And if you have active research partners, I think it's very fair to engage them maybe in the design of research data, at least design or collection, but also employ them as kind of a sounding board for your engagement planning. I know in some of our projects, we use our community-based partners for language checks to make sure the language that we're using matches how they talk about an issue, or they might be able to identify some other networks and audiences that we could use. Yeah, I think, Laura, I think so. You were thinking about involving them more in the research process and if that could be part of the engagement plan. I think it's just good to be clear as a research team on how you want to engage them. I know sometimes there are sensitivities in terms of, for instance, we know that teachers often have limited bandwidths, or just to make sure that the ask is clear up front, or that the roles and responsibilities of engaging partners are clear. But I think there are definitely really valuable opportunities to engage your partners. And I think we've actually seen that sometimes if there are quieter phases of a project, if there are ways to involve your research partners in some of the engagement planning, that can get them really excited about sharing results. So sometimes as we've had quieter phases, we've been able to engage our partners to say, like, let's think about what would be a great infographic or a video, and getting their input really helps them to feel engaged and excited about the work when there might be a little bit of a lag in terms of when you'll actually have results to share.
Well, we have two questions that are similar from Danielle and Lizzie. So Danielle says, any suggestions for engaging teachers specifically who may not read journal articles or follow us on social media? And then Lizzie says, similar to Danielle, our team is currently thinking about broadly accessible modes of dissemination. For example, how can we make products accessible and immediately useful for teachers?
Yeah. Those are great. And I think what's hard about reaching teachers is the kind of like the limited bandwidth, and also some of the places that teachers go to are not maybe where we would normally share things. So yeah, like Pinterest, or, some of these resource sites of kind of like free resources for teachers. So we know like teachers' bandwidth is sometimes limited to kind of find information. I think some of the strategies that I've seen on projects I've been on is to kind of leverage some of like the membership associations. It kind of depends on if you're associations, whether it's related to a specific content area, can be really powerful messengers, and they kind of have credibility already in the field. And so building relationships with those organizations can be meaningful, and oftentimes they have their own social media feeds, newsletters, and so if you could kind of give them blurbs, they can get the word out. But I hear you on making products accessible and useful to teachers. I think if there are ways to leverage teachers who might be involved in the research, they can be great sounding boards to think through the design of materials, whether they're one pagers, short videos, things that will kind of be useful to them, whether it's in a professional development setting or other places. And I just think it's always good to kind of have a check on like plain language as well, to make sure that you're not taking kind of whole cloth research language and trying to put it in a dissemination product, but that you're kind of going through a process to also maybe have either a current teacher or someone else who can bring that lens to do kind of a plain language review, just to make sure it's not too jargony, that it reads as kind of using the same terminology that they're using in practice. But I think we have some good, I know some of the experts who are here with us today, and if you have practices that you've used in designing products for teachers, I'd also welcome other thoughts and strategies in the chat.
Okay, Emily, no more questions in the chat so far, if you want to proceed.
Okay, great. Those are all really wonderful questions, and I think really appreciate them. So we'll continue on, but as other things come to mind, feel free to continue to add them in the chat, and we can get to them in our next Q&A time. So components of the engagement plan, there are different components that projects may use. Here are some that we typically use at AIR, but there may be others that you have used or might like to use. The first is the goal of the project. And here, this is really an effort to state the goals of the project in plain language. So moving beyond maybe the official formal research questions that you're examining, but reflecting as a team, what are your overall goals for the project? What are you aiming to learn, to examine, to develop? And it's really an opportunity to put in simple phrasing what you're trying to accomplish, as well as are there certain policies or practices that you're looking to examine and to improve. And this could really also be a really valuable opportunity for a team to coalesce around the goals of the project and kind of make sure everybody is who's working on these engagement activities has a clear understanding of where the project is headed. The next is the identification of your audiences and key messengers. We'll get into this on the next slide, but you want to be thoughtful upfront about who are the different audiences that you're trying to reach with this project. Who's affected by this project and the results, and who might be benefit from knowing more. These may be the same people who are involved in your project, but it's likely to be even a broader audience. So you may be working with a certain district, certain groups of teachers, but you can also think more in a broader context about wider networks that you might be trying to reach. The strategies, this is really thinking through the different types of dissemination strategies, whether it's developing one-pagers, videos, social media content, op-eds, but thinking through how you're matching each of these strategies to the audiences so that you're thinking through approaches that match how your audiences consume and understand information. And then key messages. This is typically as a project has findings and the analysis results are more final. It can be really helpful for a team to identify the key messages and takeaway from the project, again, in plain language, non-technical language, just to hone in on the essential components of the message. And again, this is for disseminating findings to non-technical audiences. Certainly, if you're trying to communicate to researchers, you may take a different approach, but I think this can still be a really valuable exercise for a team to kind of reflect on the very kind of headline takeaways from a project. And then finally, an outcomes tracker, thinking about how you're going to track the outcomes from your dissemination efforts. And the engagement plan can serve as a living document. In some of our projects, we have built out a larger Microsoft Word document where we're kind of inputting our metrics into that plan. So we have one broader portfolio, so to speak, that includes both the plans that we have for our project, but allows us to kind of actively track the metrics in the same spot. Next slide. So it's a really meaningful exercise to identify your target audiences for your dissemination activities. And like I said, these may be the same individuals that you see participating in your research, but likely is a little bit of a broader group or might include additional groups. And then you'll want to reflect on how each of these audiences consume information and match it to the proposed approach. So this is a sample slide. Here we've thought about potential audience members as teachers, district leaders, state education agency staff, policymakers, community members, and the research community that you could select from as potential audiences. But again, this is not to be exclusive of other groups or other collaborators that you might identify for your research. So we're going to pause a minute and have another activity. And in the Zoom chat, I would love for you to maybe identify, maybe pick one of these audiences and just share an example approach that either you have used or have seen work for one of them. So if you want to just name the group, and then after that, maybe just give us a little snapshot of what approach you use to reach them. I'm gonna move. Thank you. Oh, TikTok videos. Shelley, I'm intrigued, but I agree. I have not yet produced TikTok videos for projects, but it does seem like a way to reach people. Great. Lots of presentations for briefing materials can be really helpful. Short videos. These are all really great. Presentations to teachers, one pages for legislators. Yeah, I think that that's all just right. Yeah, TikTok is interesting. I think I don't have experience. I would love to think more. I know that at least some of us who work on federal projects have not been able to leverage that out of some security concerns, but that's through federally funded projects. So I think, but I also know a lot of news outlets are using TikTok to kind of get, engage people in a really fun way and snapshots. So it's worth discussing, I think, and exploring some of these newer platforms. Great. Yeah, professional associations and professional development for teachers and CEUs, definitely. Let's advance to the next slide. You guys are giving, I feel like I wish I could annotate this live because you're giving a lot of suggestions, but here are just some example approaches. I think many of you guys have highlighted these in your comments, but here are some ways that we at AIR have developed approaches for these different audiences. And again, you could probably refine each of these to be a little bit more specific depending on the type of maybe specific types of district leaders or certain community member groups with more specificity. So this is still kind of a broader level table than what you probably would want to do as a team to really hone in on who exactly you're trying to reach and what are going to be the resources that will really help them to consume and engage with the information. Next slide. One thing that I want to just also bring into this conversation is that it's really valuable and important to bring in diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations. And I'd like to say that all dissemination plans really should consider the diversity of the groups who are involved in the project, as well as the diversity of the groups who are going to use the results. And again, you can bring into your dissemination planning these DEI considerations, whether or not your project is specifically looking at equity gaps. There's really meaning and value in reflecting on how can you make your resources accessible and really thoughtful about how you're sharing the results with a wide variety of community partners. Here are some framing questions that came to my mind that projects can engage with around these considerations, but there may be more considerations that come to your mind in this work. Things that you might reflect on are, do the identified audiences for your dissemination planning capture the full range of interested and affected parties? So whether you're looking at different student groups or different geographic areas, just making sure that you kind of have a wide look at who you're trying to reach. What language and framing do your partners and identified audiences use related to this topic? And also, how do they describe the need related to this work? We know that in the research world, oftentimes we're presenting the urgency of a given topic, but it can bring some deficit framing with it sometimes. And in these public facing, especially community oriented dissemination activities, you want to be mindful of making sure that you're using an asset-based approach and making sure that you're not casting blame on a group of students or communities as you're presenting the results. And we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A if you'd like. Are the resources designed to be accessible and fit your audience, how your audiences intake information? This could be related to accessibility in terms of 508 compliance and being accessible to individuals with disabilities. It could also be accessible in terms of grade level and the readability of the text. It gets into some of that plain language discussion that we talked about. I guess I have it in the final bullet too. I'm thinking especially towards practitioner or family-oriented resources. That's where it's really important to think through how are you going to have checks for plain language, and especially that they're written for a non-technical audience. On the next slide, we highlighted a few resources that came to mind in our work, but certainly this is just a snapshot of some resources. Would welcome your thoughts in the chat if there are others that you've seen. One of them is from Chicago Beyond called Why Am I Always Being Researched? This is a guidebook that takes an approach beyond just dissemination, but it looks at strategies researchers can use to reflect on unintended bias when it comes to conducting and disseminating research. And it takes a broader approach and focuses on an equity-based approach to research. So that might be one place to begin, just for good food for thought. Plainlanguage.gov is a US government website focused on plain language. Some of it is targeted towards federal agencies, but it has a lot of really useful checklists, trainings, and other resources related to plain language, and could be a helpful place to look if you're just looking for some tools and some strategies to translate technical information and research into plain language. The Communications Network is a great resource for nonprofit communications, and they have a page on DEI resources, including the Progressive Style Guide, other DEI-related communication resources. So would encourage you to go there for a suite of materials. And then finally, in this space, there's been a lot of work done in the health space around framing and language. And so the final two, there's a community-centered toolkit from the University of Minnesota Program in Health Disparities Research. And it uses a similar structure to what I've talked about today, but also brings in how you might engage communities in the development of dissemination strategies. And then the final is a style guide that the CDC developed related to around COVID-19 and equity, but includes some principles and preferred terms for non-stigmatizing bias-free language. Some of it is specific to health, but I wanted to present it because it has some valuable tables that kind of present some shifts in language, especially to shift towards that more asset-based framing. And I think there are strategies and approaches that you could bring into other content areas. Next slide. We already touched on this a little bit, but you'll want to consider how to measure impact as part of your dissemination planning. So components of that will be to identify the measures that you want to use, think about which tools will support the collection of data related to dissemination, and then revisit the measurement plan throughout the course of the project. So you develop this plan through the launch and your iterative phases, and then it's at the end where you're really looking at some of the analytics. Next slide. I think I highlighted this a little bit before, but briefly, you can consider what data are available to you through tools like website analytics, newsletter report, social media as measures to look at. Here are some example goals that you could set out. So for resource visibility, you might set out a goal of 5 mentions of your resource or your report in news media or education blogs. You might set out some goals related to website engagement or downloads, as well as use. So welcome your comments in the Zoom chat. What additional tools might one use to capture dissemination outcomes? Are there some that you've used, or what do you look for in terms of measuring impact? I'm going to continue forward, but I'd love for you to enter your thoughts in the chat as we share an example. So I wanted to share an example from, this is a STEM project that AIR did separate from the DRK work, but it is shows you how one might approach engagement planning for a STEM focused project. So for this project, the way to kind of phrase the project's simple goal was to better understand youth experiences in STEM oriented summer learning programs and how those experiences related to the learning environment and staff practices. And this project actually had some analyses and reports that were specifically focused on the learning environment and staff practices. And the audiences for this project included staff and leaders of out-of-school STEM programs. Again, that's one audience. They probably had a number of them. Next slide. Then in terms of key messengers, this project did partner with Click2Science, U4Youth, as well as national after-school organizations to help amplify the results. Some of the strategies that they used to achieve the goals of reaching these audiences were to have a practitioner-oriented toolkit that was based off of their analyses. They also had professional development resources, as well as brief videos on the featured programs, and all of this was collected in a website. They had a key message that kind of summarized the findings in a simple statement. The more youth experienced in the moment engagement in programming during the span of the summer, the more likely they were to report growth in STEM interest and future aspirations. So a very large project summed up in one sentence. And then I'm not sure what outcomes this project necessarily used. I wasn't immediately involved in it, but they could have collected metrics related to website clicks, resource downloads, or look at the use of their materials in different professional development trainings. Next slide. I also wanted to highlight that Cadre has a dedicated space on their website related to dissemination. They have really good resources, a project communication plan, a guide to product dissemination. And so we definitely encourage you to explore these resources as you prepare for dissemination. And we'll put these links, I think Jen's putting them in the link to the chat, and this slide deck will also be posted so that you'll have live access to these links as well. And with that, I think we've hit our next moment to have some question and answers, and I'm happy to respond to other questions or thoughts that have come to your mind during the second half.
While you're waiting for questions, Emily, if I could add the methods and approaches, you see the, if you don't mind just popping back to the last slide real quick, I just wanted to say that Cadre has put together some really great methods and approaches for dissemination. And you could see there's examples under each of the categories on the screen. So we really encourage you to check that out. And as Emily mentioned, the links are in the chat.
How important is social media for dissemination? Thanks, Jen, for getting the questions going. I think it can be really important. I think it's helpful to think through what audiences you're trying to reach and which social media platforms they might be on. But I think we've seen some good take up on LinkedIn as like professional, networking with professionals and kind of amplifying research there. I think that Twitter can be useful, but you can think through whether if you're kind of who can help amplify it, and you might consider, is there social media language that you could give to an association or others to kind of help amplify, retweet. So I think there is some power, but some of it is just breaking through the noise. So I think it's important to plan for it, but not to rely on it as your sole outreach strategy. Other questions? What comes to mind? What seems difficult? I would love to hear your questions and thoughts.
There's another question here from Carol. Any suggestions for how to optimize engagement for journal articles?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know that sometimes it's challenging in that a journal article may not come out at the same time as the broader project findings. One thing that you can consider doing is layering together resources. So you might highlight a journal article maybe alongside other resources related to the project or kind of feature it together as a suite. I think there's power in that you might get broader amplification for people who might want to take a look at the journal article, but maybe take a look at a parallel companion infographic that summarizes it. So for some audiences, the journal article might be the piece that they're going to dig into, and some people might benefit maybe from a companion one pager that might be more accessible to a policymaker or someone that won't dig into the full article.
Oh, we have another question from Patty asking, is there a way to engage students? They seem to be masters in social media.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I guess it depends on if students are involved in a project. We've definitely seen a lot of value in elevating student voice. So as you're thinking through telling the story about a project or how you want to share the results, is there an opportunity to bring their stories and their experience as part of this, whether it's including them in a video, having them kind of share their thoughts in other ways? But, in terms of how to engage them on social media, I'm not quite sure. It kind of depends on what networks you're trying to reach and what kind of relationship, what practices you're trying, like what are your goals? But I agree that I think for us, it's been kind of bringing in student voice and hearing from them about their experience has been at least powerful in terms of us not kind of overwriting their experience as the lead researchers, but hearing from them as well.
One last question from Dean. What do you think about the value of using infographics as an engagement product?
Yeah, I really like infographics as a companion resource to a research study, especially if you're trying to share the findings maybe with a policymaker, maybe, a state education agency, someone who might not dig into the full findings. It can be a nice way to maybe present a few key data points, a chart in a really visually engaging way. I think it's helpful to approach infographics with a fresh eye. You may have your charts and data presented in the formal report in a certain way, but there are some really valuable resources around data visualization that can help you think through what are going to be the most engaging tables or ways to present contrasting data in those infographics. So I would just say, I think they're really powerful, but you don't want to just take whole cloth your text and your graphics from your abstract and put them in a design. You want to kind of take a fresh look at what's going to make sense to your audience, and especially using that plain language. Are there free apps to build infographics? That's a great question. Sonica says yes. I'm pausing. A lot of people use Canva. I know we've used that for social media graphics. Visme. And then I see a question how to share more detailed strategies to do like an outcomes tracker. I think typically sometimes what it looks like in our planning is to either insert a table in the engagement plan or maybe have a standalone table where we're laying out goals and then maybe having points in time where we're going to revisit. It kind of depends on how long of a tail you have to take a look at your metrics in terms of how much you can come back and kind of revisit the strategy. Sometimes I know it's kind of a quick burst of sharing materials at the end of a project. And so your window to kind of capture outcomes might be shorter. Sometimes you might be disseminating results and there's another phase of the project that comes. And so you can kind of revisit use and analytics over a wider period of time. But I would say trying to set out some certain moments in time where you want to take a look at those outcomes is definitely helpful.
Well, thank you, Emily. That was very informative and helpful. We've got a couple other things to share with you before we close. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we'd like to keep in touch. We have a website page on the Cadre site where you can get this recording, and we'll be sharing information on upcoming events. And if we go to the next slide, one of the upcoming events that we're working on now is putting together a community of practice around designing a communication and engagement plan. And it's going to be over 3 sessions every 2 weeks, starting in late July and running through August. And this is a fantastic opportunity to work with your peers to actually build out your own engagement plan if you wish, or to participate and just learn more in general. And if you decide to build out an engagement plan, we will have experts review it for you and provide you with customized feedback. So we will be sending out an email to everyone who attended this webinar shortly, and we hope that you take advantage of the community of practice that we're putting together. And we're going to also canvas around dates and times. So hopefully we'll be able to connect with the times and dates that work best for everyone. So we're super excited about that, and it's for the beginner to advanced level. We are going to have different options for interactions and possible homework between sessions depending on where you're at and what you'd like to learn and what you'd like to get out of the COP. So it's very flexible and it's very customized to what you need. So next slide, please. We would like to ask you to please take our evaluation survey for today's event. It would be very helpful. It's going to be popped into the chat right now. And if you just don't mind taking a moment to do that, and let me, oh, okay, so Carol popped it into the chat. If you don't mind, just after you close out, or click on that first and then close out of the meeting, and let us know what you thought. It will also help guide future topics, so we're really interested in what you have to say. And with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for your time, where it looks like we're ending at exactly the right time. So thank you for that. And Emily, thank you again for a great presentation. So everyone have a good rest of your day. And please click on that survey link first before you go.